Welcome to people who are coming in. We'll just wait a minute, maybe 1 minute or maybe 2 before Stefan starts us off.
That will be good. Numbers have been shooting up just now, and I'll give it an extra minute.
Okay, Stefan, why don't we get started?
Absolutely happy to do so. And with that, a warm welcome and hello to everyone. My name is Stefan Bauer, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this conference on the global climate governance in the face of obstruction, which we have the pleasure and privilege to co-host with the Climate Social Science Network and Brown University and my wonderful co-host Timmons. I have the privilege to welcome you on behalf of the German Development Institute here in Bonn, albeit virtually. And we are happy to be co-hosting this conference. In fact, when Timmons approached me about his idea to host a CSSN conference and workshop back-to-back with the ongoing SB meetings right around the corner here, just out of my window, he was literally or proverbially knocking at open doors. We were very happy to welcome the idea and support this sort of first CSSN full conference in cooperation with us. And of course, at the time we had the hope to be hosting this as an in-person live meeting with real people and to shake your hands and engage in the discussions. Now we had to realize the pandemic is still not fully over. There were still some restrictions in place at the time we were planning this event, and so with quite some regret we resorted to doing this as an online conference. But on a happy note, this enables us to accommodate much more conference participants than we would have been able to accommodate in our on-site venue, where we would have been restricted to somewhere below 100 people, whereas now we have several hundred registrations for the conference, and we are very excited and thrilled about that and appreciate the interest. And having said that, I should not forget to also extend a warm welcome on behalf of our director, Professor Anna-Katarina Hornitsch, who has also been very supportive in enabling us to make this happen. And without further ado, I will now hand over to Timmons, who will be on top of being really a wonderful colleague and friend and collaborator in this, will be our master of ceremony for today and also give us some inspiring kickoff notes in his keynote in a moment. So thank you all for joining us. Also thank you to our speakers, obviously. And Timmons, I hand the virtual baton over to you.
Thank you, Stefan. It's really a pleasure to be organizing this session and this conference with you all at DIE. Let's see, I now have to find I have my presenter notes here, and it suddenly doesn't have the actual script. It's gone missing, so I'm going to have to exit this. Welcome, everybody. We should have our ominous music playing from that video that we put together. In fact, Stefan said, that was very American of us to have such dramatic music in the background. And I thought, yes, we're very heavy-handed, we're shameless, and this is actually the the future of the world we're talking about. So of course we had to use the dramatic music. So again, thank you for putting up with that as well, Stefan. And I want to thank Okalu Mathis, who's also here at DIE, for co-organizing with us. Unfortunately, she's sick today, and we're very sad about her not being able to be here. We were going to have the event, of course, downstairs in this wonderful event rooms. I'm here, got my badge today to go to the UN climate negotiations, the building I can see right across here. And I was looking forward to welcoming a lot of new CSSN, Climate Social Science Network members to experience the climate negotiations. And I'm very sorry we couldn't do that. But again, we're very happy that we're getting to reach a lot of people. And we saved a lot of jet fuel. And hopefully the planet is a little tiny bit better from our having done that. I want to thank Stephanie Damasa Hansen, Trevor Culhane, Michael Pulgar Cabrera, Alex, and Andrew here at DIE, and our wonderful event team at We and Goliath. I want to highly recommend them. They have been really fabulous if you have an event to organize. So I'm Timmons Roberts. I'm a professor at Brown University in our Institute on Environment and Society. I direct the Climate and Development Lab. I brought in Robert Bruhl, who I, at the time and still think is one of the most respected and well-known experts on climate obstruction to the lab. And we've received some core funding from the High Tide Foundation to found the Climate Social Science Network only about 18 or 20 months ago. We thought it was going to be 30 or 50 people. We're now over 330 members around the world. It's very exciting. There's much to talk about the network. I just encourage people to go on our website, cssn.org, and have a look around. We have working groups. We give out grants for research in this area, and so on. Just on how the conference is going to go, today we have some words from me. I'm going to be about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to hand it to Joanna Setzer from London School of Economics, and then she's going to talk about litigation and climate litigation and why social science can help with that. Then there's a panel on national climate context of climate obstruction. We're going to hear from experts on Spain, Brazil, the UK, Bangladesh, Australia, the US, Sweden, and Canada for a quick panel discussion to give us some very initial ideas on how climate obstruction varies around the world. We have another panel after that where we're going to have a discussion from some experts on the fossil fuel industry. And we're going to talk about the industry broadly, but then also in the climate negotiations. You know, in these negotiations, we've just not heard much discussion on you know, how obstruction works here. Then members of CSSN will switch over to a different platform where we'll have a sort of reception. Tomorrow we have a closed session for members at this time, and then we have later, about an hour and a half from now, we have a public plenary talk by Peter Newell, which will be on the obstruction in the international political economy of climate governance. And then we have a panel discussion of top people involved in this debate over loss and damage, the idea that there should be some compensation or liability or some kind of mechanism to help the countries that have been damaged by climate impacts. And then Friday, there's another public plenary by Frank Bierman, who founded the Earth System Governance, and then we'll do a wrap up to think about looking ahead towards the negotiation. So just what I want to do very briefly here is to cast a flashlight briefly around in what's a pretty dark and largely unknown world of climate obstruction. So here's basically the theory of change of the Climate Social Science Network. That is, we know the science. We have 4 decades we have known that for 4 decades, or even some people would say for 130 years. We have the technology. That is, our technology keeps getting better and better and cheaper and cheaper. And we have the policy tools that have been shown to work when they're well instituted on what to do about climate change, but we have largely failed. Greenhouse gas emissions are not falling, they've barely leveled off. And they need to fall by a rate of probably 4 to 7% a year. Just for us to do what we said we would do in 1992 when the Framework Convention on Climate Change was originally agreed by 194 countries. That is, that we would prevent dangerous climate change. There's been 56 meetings now of the subsidiary bodies. That's the group that's meeting right now, that had the sort of intersessional meetings, and we're up to 26 conferences of the parties. And we've still been unable to stop the temperatures rising or the seas rising. So it brings us to this question: why is climate action so inadequate? Our answer is that this was not inevitable. It's not the result of, at least not solely the result of, human nature or this being a wicked problem. Some of these have some truth in them. It's not the psychology of humanity, but rather we don't actually know the extent to which these hypotheses are true, because we don't have this counterfactual case where a highly complex evolving network mobilized with billions and billions of dollars around the world to slow and stop action on climate change. It worked to distort scientific understanding, to undermine consensus on the need to act decisively, and then when it couldn't do those, it sought to delay meaningful action. And in fact, as Bob Brill points out, delaying climate action has always been part of the actions of that group. Those seeking to advance action on climate change need to develop and carry out strategies that are informed by a detailed understanding of these networks of obstruction. That's our sort of guiding hypothesis here, of these organizations that obstruct action and how they work. Civil society groups, the public, litigators, investigators, politicians, journalists, academics, and business people all need solid, systematic research documenting who the obstructors are, what they're doing, and how they're doing it. However, our understanding is very poor. It's, as I said, a dark area. We're just trying to cast a flashlight now and then start to explore this area. We know a lot about a few parts of the network. Mostly we've learned, thanks to pioneering work by Neela Banerjee, Jane Mayer, Christopher Leonard, Naomi Oreskes, Jeffrey Suprin, Ben Ferranta, among others, about how much Exxon knew and how much the David and Charles Koch family and their networks of billionaires know and knew through the years and how they acted. So that's part of our sort of national level understanding. We know a growing amount about the United States. There's still huge gaps. We know, I would say, sort of the next tier of countries down are Australia, Canada, the UK, where we have some research underway, but it's still a lot is very much unknown. Europe, the rest of the world is sort of entirely unstudied, or at least we want to hear more about it, and we think people need to know. So we'll be hearing from research around the world in a few minutes of these national contexts, but I'm going to be talking some about the local level, where our knowledge is extremely spotty and thin, and sometimes almost anecdotal. And at the international level, that is in the negotiations, we know very little. We have a few anecdotal accounts, of why, Copenhagen in 2009 went sideways, or what happened in the room at the final negotiations of the Paris Agreement and so on. But we don't know really anything systematic. And that's remarkable. We don't know about other huge international institutions like the World Trade Organization, the G7, or the G20. We don't know really about obstruction and if it's acting and how it does in the UN General Assembly or the Security Council, in the World Bank, in the regional development banks, and so on. There's just so much we don't know. So I thought I'd start with a very simple example of some of our research that we did. We did this unfunded with a group of students in my lab several years ago. And we looked at all the testimony. We went to the state legislature and asked for copies, and we scanned into our phones every piece of testimony. And we counted who were the people who were testifying for and against climate change and clean energy legislation in the state of Rhode Island, a state of 1 million people. And what we found were really this group of companies and actors on the left. And then on the right, this was comparing it to the groups that show up in the US Congress in the period that's at the top from 2010 to 2015. This is from some of Bob Brill's research. And it was so simple and descriptive, but very powerful. And I think a lot of people really appreciated knowing who were the actors that were showing up. So this is just sort of a cheerleading really for people who want to do research. A funder that is a foundation in New England who's been working a lot on clean energy, trying to advance climate action, said, wait a minute, we need this in the other states. So we did 2 studies in Massachusetts and Connecticut. I want to thank Galen Hall and Trevor Culhane on this work. And we put out these 2 reports through CSSN, and they're on our website, cssn.org. It's very simple. We get the piece of testimony, which is sort of here in this this rendering here of a piece from the Massachusetts Association of Realtors. And what we do is we collect all the testimony. In this case, we collected 1,452 pieces of legislation on 53 priority bills of climate change advocates. And we just coded them on who was testifying, what was their economic sector, were they in an official capacity, what's their position on the bill, are they for or against it? And then we started to look at their discursive frames, that is, what are the arguments that they're putting out there. This is just very simple descriptive information on how many people show up in the legislature. And we could see that individuals, environmental groups, government organizations, all these were almost always in favor, and 90% of the testimony was in favor. The groups that were opposed are just these few down here in red: heating oil, fossil fuels, utilities, and the real estate industry. We learned that the real estate industry is actually quite important, and we had never seen that in any literature anywhere before. In Connecticut, we only had testimony. So Trevor led on this categorizing of legislation. Here we have all the economic sectors down at the bottom of the screen, with the ones on the left are the ones who tended to support the climate activists' positions. The ones on the right were from economic sectors that tended to oppose them. And then here were the whole set of sort of climate and clean energy strategies, bills, policies that were put forward in the legislature, and how often they were for and against them. So we learned a lot, and the organizations in Connecticut said that this was extremely useful. We summed up the amount of money that each of these sectors spent on hiring professional lobbyists. And you can see quite a difference between the amount of money on the groups that tended to support environmentalist legislation and those that tended to oppose that legislation. And you can also see the importance of utilities and fossil fuel corporations and real estate groups. This was in Massachusetts. This was a really interesting analysis led by Galen Hall, showing this sort of networks, a network analysis, and how on different types of bills, who tended to oppose them. So you can see on hydroelectricity and wind power bills that the utilities tend to be quite supportive of hydro and wind, and be in coalition actually, or let's say lobbying in the same way, in the same direction as social greens. It was really mostly the power generators who were against the hydro and wind power bills. But on the case of solar power, there was a huge amount of opposition from utilities and power generators. So the constellations look quite different depending on the piece of legislation. And here's some at the national level. This is from Bob Brule's, a couple of his pieces, and with Carmichael and Arancic. That is showing a huge surge in spending on lobbying in the United States, right as the Waxman-Markey bill was gaining traction in Congress. This was the one time really in American history that there was a chance of real climate change legislation that involved carbon pricing and regulation. And it went from about 50 million a year to 350 million a year. And the same surge could be seen also in the advertisements of five fossil fuel corporations, oil and gas corporations. We have another report led by Caroline Jones and Bob Brule that looks at the coalitions of these groups, which could also be described as front groups. That is, these are some of the trade organizations: Edison Electric, Competitive Enterprise Institute, Western Fuels, American Petroleum Institute. Sorry, this is sort of a peak organization that's been very involved in climate denial in the United States. And then here's the series of coalitions that they created, or front groups. And it was often the same players in different combinations in these groups. So that's one of their strategies. And then this is just a look at the economic sectors, to go back to that, casting flashlight in the darkness. This is another one compiled by Bob Brule, and I think I wanted to show this because it points out just the vast number of groups that we need to study. It's not just the oil and gas industry, but rather, there's shipping, there's the auto industry, there's agriculture. We're hoping to have a new working group on agriculture and forests very soon in CSSN, the building industry and real estate, of course, the coal industry, utilities, and on down the list, faith-based groups and so on. So there is no shortage of areas for research. This is one last figure from Bob Brule's work, and that is showing that there's often strategies in the short term that include the lobbying, legislative issue advertising, citizen mobilization, campaign contributions, and so on. But there's much deeper strategies that are going on in the intermediate term, developing worldview, policy worldviews, policy actions done through think tanks and also through university programs and so on. And then there's a long-term strategy. And here's this one of our primers that we've released through CSSN that shows really if you want to influence policy on the right over here, if you're a group on the left, you can do that directly, or you can work through many other, through affecting the political agenda, but you also probably have created think tanks, you're funding university programs, you have trade associations and advocacy groups. And then this is really an area that the work is really exploding right now, and that is advertising agency, public relations firms are turning out to be really crucial ringleaders in organizing obstruction to climate action around the world. So we don't know much about other national contexts. We know some, we'll hear some in just a minute, but then the international level as well, we don't know that much. And this is just, again, our CSSN website I want to send people to. And I think that's going to be it for me. I want to hand the baton now over to Joanna Setzer from London School of Economics, who's an assistant professor there, and who will talk briefly about how social science research on climate obstruction is being used in climate liability lawsuits and in investigations. So Joanna, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Timmons, and thank you for organizing this conference. It's great to see CSSN coming together also in this forum, even if remotely at this point, but yeah, many more good things to come. So Timmons asked me to speak for 5 minutes only, so it's going to be very short, and he asked me to address 3 questions. So I'll be very to the point and try to answer to his 3 questions. Before, I just wanted to say that I feel that there is a good reason why this example of climate litigation is a good example to bring here as an illustration of how social science can be used in real world. I know I'm slightly biased, but the reality is that this is an area in which social science has already had a real life impact and could have even more. And therefore, this is already an invitation for colleagues to, within their areas of expertise, feed into this body of research that is supporting many of the cases and decisions. So the first question that Timmons asked is, how is social science work being used by litigators and investigations and courts? So just 2 examples to illustrate that. As I said, it is already being used. And the first example I wanted to mention is on the idea of fair shares. So for some time, social scientists have worked to determine what would be a country's fair share of reductions, and they used effort sharing models for a long time. These take into consideration a number of principles of responsibility, capability, equality, and then try to translate what are the necessary global reductions to the national or the regional level. What happens is that this was used in one of the most important landmark cases of litigation back in 2015 and successfully used. Since then, some of this work became outdated, and more recent work, for example, by Lavanya Rajamani, Niklas Hohn, and colleagues, have then advanced this thinking and indicated what could be the fair shares for existing and new NDCs under the Paris Agreement. And such fair shares ranges are already informing a number of new cases, litigation, in which the adequacy of national contributions is at issue or being challenged. The second example is one that Timons mentioned, is the work that Ben Franta and Jeff Supran and Naomi Oreskes and others have been doing on studying the history of climate denial and disinformation and delay. So their investigation on the history of behavior of fossil fuel producers, including what they knew about global warming science and when and what they told to the public and how they've influenced policy, have already provided evidence and important grounds to several claims brought in the US, but also in other countries, challenging the action or misinformation campaigns by carbon majors. So connected to these, we can also bring the climate washing or greenwashing claims that have been brought. And this is where a report that we did under our working group, CSSN working group on climate accountability, has also already apparently contributed to understanding what this climate washing litigation has been and could be. Now, my second question and answer is what directions these cases are taking. And that's a very good question because I said, yes, it's already impacting, but what is the impact of this litigation? I think that's the question that Timons was asking. And I'm answering this question in two ways. First, that there is a very more straightforward but limited way in understanding what litigation is leading to. And what you would do there is that you would consider what is the final verdict in the context of a case and see if the outcomes were advancing or undermining climate action. The issue is that, well, it's straightforward to do this looking at the case and what the decision was. That is very limited because we know by now that strategic litigation is much more than just a filing and a decision. And this is where there's a lot of scope for further research, because a broader approach to understanding impact looks at the indirect impacts of climate litigation. And here we're looking at impacts outside the court proceedings, beyond the decision, and what happens before and during and after a case has been brought, and how you could measure these in a quantitative or also even in a qualitative and even quantitative way. So we could be looking into the changes on behavior of parties. We could be looking at changes to public opinion, how the financial and reputational consequences of litigation are changing decisions, and also how it might be bringing further litigation, increasing the risk of litigation, even when a case has been dropped. And finally, also understanding perhaps the negative impacts of litigation. We talk about backlashes, about lawsuits being filed against climate action, against scientists, against activists. So there's a lot there to be explored, not to mention also understanding what makes a difference in terms of cases that will have a more systemic impact, how they engage with science, what science, who is bringing, and so on. So I finished this question with this invitation to colleagues in social science to also understand the broader impacts of litigation outside of courts, because the lawyers tend to be very narrow in looking only at the case and few cases, and there's much more than can be assessed in terms of the impacts. And I finished this very short intervention with the last question that Timons asked. That was if litigation can be important for climate negotiations and the broader processes of governance. And I will answer in only, there are many ways again to answer, but I will give one example that I think it's particularly important, which is you might have read the assessment, the IPCC assessment report 6, and you will notice that for the first time, climate litigation has been mentioned in working group 2 on adaptation, but very strongly in the assessment report of working group 3 on mitigation. not only there's a whole section on that with many pages explaining the cases, explaining what are the cases against governments and against corporations, which is not obvious to bring into this political context of an IPCC where most states wouldn't like to be sued for lack of action, but that passed. Not only that's in the body of the assessment report, but also in the summary for policymakers, there is one sentence saying that, and I quote, "The outcome and ambition of climate governance has been affected by climate litigation." So this is there, it has evidence, and it shows how climate litigation became one of the tools of climate governance, and one that deserves certainly more attention and exploration by other colleagues outside of the legal scholarship. So thank you all, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this conference.
Timmons, you're muted.
Okay, that had to happen once, right? Maybe it'll happen again. My apologies. Joanna, thank you so much. That was brilliant and amazingly succinct. I'm going to pass the ball now for this next session on national context of climate obstruction to Jenny Stevens, who's the director of Northeastern University School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and the Dean's Professor of Sustainability Science and Policy at Northeastern University. Jenny, thanks so much for herding a lot of cats on this session.
Great. Well, thank you. And great to be here with all of you. And thank you all for joining. And thanks to all the organizers and Timmons and Stefan for pulling this all together. In the next hour and 15 minutes or so, we are going to hear from 8 experts who have insights on different parts of the world and climate obstruction in different national contexts. And as Timmons mentioned, we don't know that much in terms of details sometimes about all of the different ways that climate obstruction is manifesting itself. And we know some of the strategies and rhetoric is similar in different places, and some is quite different. So this panel, we get a chance to just hear briefly from 8 different experts. And I'm going to save time, we're going to ask each of them to introduce themselves rather than me trying to introduce everybody. And what I'm going to do right now is just remind everyone of the order of the 8 people. And then we'll go through, and we're going to start by asking each person to introduce themselves, explain which national context they know they're going to share with us insights on, and also start to tell us a little bit about who are the main players and what are some of the most obvious big action steps or strategies going on. So the first, at this time, we're just going to ask everyone to do a short 3-minute introduction of both yourself and what you know about the specific national context that you're going to share with us. And so the order we're going to go in, we will first hear from Nuria Almiron, Ruth McKee, Christian Downey, Martin Holtman, Carlos Milani, Omar Farouk, Justin Farrell, and then Deborah Davidson. So that is the same order that listed on the program. And we will just hear from each of them right now for an initial 3-minute introduction. So Nuria, do you want to start us off?
Thank you. Yes, well, I am Nuria Almiron. I have been working for 5 years on a project focused on think tanks, denial and obstructionism in Europe. And actually, I don't feel an expert on the topic because the topic is so wide and huge, and we have just studied think tanks. So I will just provide like some glimpses that I have from the country I live in, Spain, which was one of the countries we included in our analysis of the think tanks. And what we can say from the very beginning is that here we don't have really big players in the area of organizations like think tanks. having really a huge weight in framing the topic against action for climate change. There are some little think tanks which are focused on this, but they are not really the main players. The main players in climate change inaction and obstruction are the lobbies from the industries, and probably the most important from the energy and the animal-based food. First energy, and above all energy, because energy, as you know, was the main and first industrial sector acknowledged as being main contributor to climate change warming. But animal-based food agriculture has been increasingly acknowledged as it, and the industries also reacting against this. So, that's important in Spain, and I close with this because, as you know, Spain is a very sunny country, and we should be very much ahead in terms, for instance, of solar energy, and we are really underdeveloped because of different lobbying issues that I will explain later. And we are also an ideal place to grow vegetables, and we are the leading meat consumer in the EU. So just the opposite of what should be according to our nature here.
Great. Thank you, Nuria. Ruth.
Hello, I'm Ruth Mackay, and I am going to just sort of discuss what we know around obstruction in the United Kingdom. And we don't know as much as we do on the US. So we know a lot about the US, still not enough. And the UK is sort of similar. There's a growing awareness and understanding and body of research that's coming out to tell us about what obstruction looks like in the UK. And provisionally, we can start to see some of the same actors that we see in the US. The fossil fuel industry does play a role. So the history of large transnational corporations such as Shell and BP, they in particular have some connections to sort of government authorities in the UK, particularly the Oil and Gas Authority in the UK. It's the main sort of regulator for the oil and gas industry. And there are overlaps and ties between board members, the Oil and Gas Authority, and oil and gas industries, or previous people that worked in the oil and gas industry. It's also a central hub for finance in the UK, and that we wonder what role banks in particular play in this broader obstruction global industry. And London is a financial hub here, and in particular the Bank of England recently did its own climate risk model regarding the impact of climate change. Yet since those risk models have been created, there has been little to no developments, including offering loans and services for fossil fuel industry actors. Now, in terms of their ability to influence government decision making, obstruction is very much on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. There's close ties between think tanks and think tank models that we've seen operate in a similar way to the US. A big example is the Institute of Economic Affairs, which has a history in the UK as a right-leaning think tank associated earlier on with Margaret Thatcher, with ties to other obstruction think tanks in other countries. And they were on the side of the tobacco industry earlier on. And that playbook manifested and transformed into the climate issue. They have close ties with Conservative members who use their policy documents to articulate their policy proposals. And there are other big think tanks who also have a lot of media time and particularly in those on the right-wing media in the UK that are advancing these obstruction narratives. And that's what we know so far or can gauge on the UK context.
Great, thank you, Ruth. Next, Christian Downey, you're going to tell us, I think, about the Australian context.
Yeah, hello everyone, and terrific to be part of this panel, and so great to see this conference come to life. So I'm based at the Australian National University in Canberra, and I guess like most of you, I've been thinking about politics around climate change for more than a decade or two now, seeing it both working in think tanks, working in governments, but more recently in universities. For those of you that aren't that familiar with Australia, we're really one of the worst performers on climate change. We've had one of the highest per capita emissions in the world for a long time, one of the highest in the OECD. One of the reasons for that has been the dominance of coal and gas in our energy supply. And it's really these sectors that have probably led obstruction efforts. But consistent with what we've seen in recent studies coming out of North America, we know that it's been industries up and down the fossil fuel supply chain that have also played their part: cement, agriculture, and elsewhere. And it's great to see Timon's mentioning agriculture, because I think they're very much an understudied industry in this space. In the Australian context, I really think the leading obstruction groups have been some of the key trading associations or key industry associations, groups like the Minerals Council of Australia, which represents all the big miners. It's got members like Rio Tinto, BHP, and so forth. And so clearly a key part of the coal industry. They've probably done, the Minerals Council has probably done more than any other actor over recent decades to obstruct action on climate change. You can add to that other industry associations like APPEA, which is the acronym for the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association, basically oil and gas. And we've also had, and I think this parallels what you see in the US, kind of cross-industry networks or lobby groups. The most well-known and arguably the most influential has been the Australian Industry Greenhouse Network. This is a kind of cross-industry lobby group. It's got coal, oil, aluminium, chemicals, iron and steel, transport, farming and forestry. So you can see it goes right up and down the supply chains. It's played a very influential role over a number of years in Australia. And back about a decade ago now, I was working in the Australian government on our carbon pricing mechanism, and when we were trying to implement that, and you saw firsthand the influence some of these groups have. Many of the executives of these associations have spent time in government. They've got strong personal connections to ministerial staffers and the like. So they've played both the inside and the outside lobbying game. And it's one of the reasons that in Australia, at least, we talk about the climate wars. We've had almost 2 decades now of political instability, which to a large extent has been driven by fights over climate change. And hopefully that's coming to an end. We've had a change of government a few weeks ago who's promised to end that. So we'll wait and see. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Martin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. It's been great that this conference is coming together. I had the Center for Studies of Climate Change Denial in Sweden. And in my very, very short summary of quite a thriving research community in the Nordic countries today comes out of a new book, which will be published by Routledge, called Climate Obstruction: How Denial, Delay, and Inaction Are Heating the Planet. And in that book, we talk about literal denial, delay, and inaction as 3 forms of obstruction: primary, secondary, and tertiary. And the first form is this that we much know of, the oil companies and those type of actors. In the Nordics, we know that those type of actors haven't really spread so much disinformation and denial as maybe in other countries. With research from environmental historian Peter Anker, for example, we know that they quite fast reframe the issue to be about sustainable development, but being able to extract oil in the Norwegian case, as well as in the Swedish case by the Lundin oil. And actually in the Nordic countries, this what we call the secondary form of obstruction, the delay form, is maybe the most important one to keep an eye on and really analyze. And the big thing here is that framing the issue that we putting up targets and goals, but the gap in between the goals and the action is very big. So this can be seen in the Swedish government, by the Social Democrats and others, and not least in Norway. And a colleague of mine, Christopher Ekberg, is doing historical research on that. But it can also be seen by the work of think tanks in Sweden, like Timbo. They have also been very forcefully reframing the issue to fit together with market mechanisms, to put the blame on consumer behavior and those type of delay tactics, so to speak. But we have seen in the Nordic countries the last 5 or 6 years, when in connection with the far right and also spread of disinformation, and Kjell Wolfs is one of the researchers studying this. We also see what we call tertiary obstruction in the Nordic in action. And here the study of Kari-Marie Norgard regarding living in denial can be highly recommended. Forthcoming research is focusing on forest industry, neoliberal think tanks by Finnish scholars, for example. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Martin, for laying out the denial, delay, and action structure, because that's a helpful way for all of us to be thinking about obstruction. Next is Carlos Milani. We'll talk about Brazil.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Carlos Milani. I am a professor at the Institute for Social and Political Studies at Rio de Janeiro State University. And I also direct the Interdisciplinary Observatory on Climate Change at the same university. Well, the national context in Brazil is particularly important these days because of the current government that we have. Under the Bolsonaro administration, climate denial, climate obstruction has developed quite a lot. This does not mean, though, that actors and narratives about climate denial, be it literally denying the existence of climate change, or interpretative denialism or implicatory denialism, do not exist beforehand. Denial and obstruction were not born with Bolsonaro, right? But under the Bolsonaro administration, they have developed quite a lot. And I believe that in the Brazilian context, we could talk about two profiles of actors that could be highlighted. The first profile would be composed of actors who are committed to economic sectors for which advancing the climate agenda would pose serious problems to their own immediate interests. This would include, of course, the agribusiness, which is responsible for, the increase of deforestation, illegal deforestation rates in Brazil in the last 5 years at least. But they are also extremely important for exports, for the country's exports, and for the generation of national revenue. And that is the reason why they are very strong, because they are very much organized and then represent a very important chunk of the Brazilian economy these days. Another sector would be the ultra-liberal economic segments against any form of state regulation in any kind, under any kind of policy in Brazil. In the energy field, there is a return of coal, a recent return of coal, and the actual construction of new thermoelectricals in Brazil, including capital coming from rising economies such as Turkey, which is very interesting for the transnational nexus that we can find in the national context of Brazil. But as I said, the federal government is extremely important. And federal states and municipalities have organized themselves in order to try to build a pro-climate agenda at the subnational level. And in the second part of my talk later on, I'll be able to talk a little bit more about actors committed to a political ideology that also associate climate denial and many other ultra-conservative agendas. But I'll leave this for later. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Lots to come back to and look forward to the additional insights. Omar.
Hello.
Hi, Omar.
Hi, my name is Omar Farouk. I am affiliated with the Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's University in Canada. I'll be talking about climate action or inaction in the Bangladeshi context. It is somewhat baffling to discuss climate inaction in Bangladesh, a growing economy, which is known as one of the most climate vulnerable countries. However, in the past decade, Bangladesh has firmly moved to a high carbon development path with an energy regime captured by several powerful actors benefiting from Bangladesh's increased dependence on fossil fuel and its unwillingness to gradually move towards a renewable energy system. These key actors include several of Bangladesh's development partners, such as China, Japan, and India. Japan International Cooperation Agency, which is Japan's official development agency, plays a critical role in persuading Bangladeshi policymakers to adopt a coal-fired power generation system. The other two development partners, China and India, took the benefits of these policy changes and adopted similar development projects in Bangladesh. For these development partners, Bangladesh offers a great opportunity to expand business activities of their core technology companies. They use development aid, such as loans and grants, to expand the business of these companies in Bangladesh's energy sector. The other key actor is the newly emerged energy entrepreneur class, Bangladesh independent power producers. In the past decade, this politically well-connected energy entrepreneur class has significantly increased the share of private sector in power generation, which receive a wide range of policy and financial support. The lobbying efforts of Bangladesh Independent Power Producers Association within the context of state business relations characterized by cronyism and policy capture have locked Bangladesh in a dirty and costly energy system. Out of 69 members of this association, only 2 have renewable energy projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Justin Farrell is going to talk about the United States.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you all. I'm here from different perspectives and experiences and research from different corners of the globe. You know, I'm a professor at Yale here in the U.S., and I would say, you know, we probably know the most here in the U.S., which maybe that's not such a good thing, about our multi-pronged and well-oiled machine of obstruction. And we have a large peer-reviewed literature, you know, thanks to many of the people who are here this conference. And I want to be brief, just since that literature is so large, and so we can hear from other people. But I'll just reiterate that it's here in the U.S. It's led by industry trade associations, individual corporations. There's been more and more work, especially from Bob Rule and others, on public relations firms, and then donor-directed philanthropy, which is a mechanism for dark money or for passing money through philanthropic organizations and being able to hide your identity. With that, though, there's also, you know, a lot of needs, and there's a lot of work that's sort of off the beaten path, at least for now. Timmons mentioned the real estate industries. And I think that's kind of where research is headed, to some of these other industries that are not as central. And, you know, even though we've learned a lot about obstruction in the US, there's much more work to do. And I, from my perspective, especially with new types of methods, You know, we use network science quite a bit. There's more work to be done there, but also with qualitative approaches. And I think, and then I'll stop, but there's especially an opportunity for collecting more what we call like naturally occurring data. For example, you know, creating networks from people and organizations who attend or speak at events or conferences, kind of similar to this. And a lot of our data is just post hoc, but it would be helpful if we had more ongoing naturally occurring data, whatever that would look like for a given topic or for a given actor or obstruction strategy. And so I just wanted to throw that out there, but this is a great panel and I'm really honored to be included. Thanks.
Thank you, Justin. And the last of our 8 introductory remarks is from Deborah Davidson, the Canadian context.
All right, thanks very much, Jenny, and thanks to the organizers. And I'm so excited to be here, and I'm just excited that CSSN exists. I think that this initiative is already making a tremendous impact, and that will only continue to grow. So I'm an environmental sociologist. I work out of the University of Alberta. I've been doing research on climate change impacts and adaptation, but also on the fossil fuel industry and politics of energy, generally speaking, in Canada. I want to thank a number of Canadian colleagues, however, from whose work I'm drawing and to whose work I would direct your attention. So people like Angela Carter, Gordon Laxer, Emily Eaton, and many other individuals who are involved in the Corporate Mapping Project, which is just a storehouse of great research focused on specifically the energy industry here in Canada. So just a few things to start off that I think are important to know about Canada that perhaps are somewhat unique. Well, first of all, Canada is among the top 10 producers, and it's the only G7 country, I think, in which emissions have increased since 1990. Canada also has a federalist structure, and that matters because a tremendous amount of autonomy and decision-making sits at the provincial level rather than at the federal level. And so anything that the federal government wants to pursue has to happen in negotiation with the provinces. And then thirdly, the most important feature of Canada is that it is, for all intents and purposes, a petrostate. There are certainly other countries that have higher levels of economic dependence on fossil fuel development. But if we define a petrostate as a place in which this particular industry sector has undue influence over politics, then that is certainly the case for Canada. And this is vivid at that provincial level, particularly in my own province of Alberta, where the lion's share of our oil and gas is produced, but also Saskatchewan and Newfoundland. So important pieces, I think, to the puzzle when we think about climate obstruction here in Canada. So we do have a handful of conservative think tanks operating here in Canada. One of the most prominent is probably the Fraser Institute, which is based in Vancouver. This is an institute that is focused more broadly on kind of promoting a neoliberalism agenda, but certainly energy and climate change features in their work. And then we have smaller, more regional groups like operating here in the prairies, a group called Friends of Science, which is more explicitly anti-climate change. But by and large, think tanks aren't the big players here in Canada, partly because we are a petrostate. And so the elephant in the room is very clearly the fossil fuel industry, and both the larger fossil fuel corporations, but also industry associations, such as the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, are major political players in this space. And then the second one, again, because we're a petrostate, the state itself, I think, needs to be acknowledged as an important player in climate obstruction. And again, you can see that most vividly here in the province of Alberta. And I'll just give a A quick example of that, a few years ago, our current political party in power was the United Conservative Party, which had gone so far as setting up a publicly funded pro-fossil fuel advocacy organization called the Canadian Energy Centre. And they basically self-describe themselves as an independent provincial corporation, the mandate of which is to promote Canada as the supplier of choice for the world's growing demand for responsibly produced energy. One final flag I would put out there, which we don't know enough about, but I would consider it kind of a priority for future research, is the role of the agricultural industry, particularly the beef sector here in Alberta, which is large, and their backs are definitely against the wall with respect to emissions.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. So what we're going to do now is, so this is a panel with these 8 people, insights on particular areas and contexts, but we do want to have some time for interactive session. So feel free to think about some questions you may have, and we will have time for some questions. But before going into questions, what we'd like to do is go through the panel lineup again. This time, I guess, with a little bit more time, maybe 4 minutes each. And what we'd like you to each share with us is any more details you have thinking about the structure and tactics of these players, of the most influential climate obstruction actors and organizations. How are they organizing themselves? How are they forming coalitions and lobbying, and how are they mobilizing and having influence, I guess, in terms of any additional insights you have about kind of the structure and tactics. And then also, I think what's really interesting, another piece that you can bring in is about kind of the culture and communication. How are, what kinds of framing and rhetorical strategies are being used to convey or not, the stance or the obstructionist tactics that are being deployed. So that's, again, it's kind of a broad question here. Another opportunity for each of you to share any more details that you have on the particular context. And obviously, as we can hear from the discussion, there's a lot of transboundary influence, right? So obviously each of these national contexts are unique, and obviously we're very aware of a lot of influence that countries have on other countries. So I will also just acknowledge, we were talking earlier as we were preparing for the panel that there are big gaps in the world here, that we don't have somebody representing China or India or lots of other places. So just acknowledging that, so let's go through the same order again, and this time we'll give 4 minutes for each, so a little bit longer time. But then is that right? Will that work? Is that too much time? We have 8 times 4. We'll almost be at the end. So maybe we keep it to the 3 minutes.
Maybe 3.
Yeah, we'll keep it to 3 minutes again. So the same short amount of time, because we do want to have some time for a few questions as well. So Nuria, back to you.
Thank you, Jenny. So difficult 3 minutes. Okay. Well, Spain is not a petro state at all. I think we are one of the best examples of climate change obstructionism not needing a huge and well-structured coalition of denials and obstructionists, because we don't have this. We have, of course, a very well-related and coalitioned conservation wing community. And I remember very well from a previous study that we were studying ideology and think tanks in Spain, where we saw very clearly how right-wing communities, including political parties, think tanks, media, etc., were and are much better in coalitioning than left or social democrats. So we have this, of course, we have this background of conservationists and right people that is where most obstructionism is. But in general, I would say that they are not the single one to blame at all. In Spain, all sorts of governments have been showing very little interest in really doing something which is really having an impact on climate change mitigation. And that means that they have, all sorts of governments have been very open to any sort of influence from outside. And for instance, I will provide 2 examples of how this obstructionism through lobbying and through also scaring by means of legal actions have been working in Spain without this big coalition of ideologies that can be put together under the label of obstructionism or denial. For instance, many years ago, the energy industry was lobbying the government at the time, a right-wing government, for a sun tax. Maybe you know the sun tax in Spain that we had for many years, a tax that penalized householders that wanted to have solar panels at home. And that meant that for a country with our many hours of sun every day, or clear light, because you know we don't need only sun to produce solar energy, but with so many light, and we are very much underdeveloped because of this tax, which meant that you could have solar panels at home, not of course only in the industry, but at home. But you were financially penalized. You had a tax because you became a producer. That was fortunately removed a few years ago, and now we have a boom of demanding from householders and private corporations for developing and deploying solar panels structures everywhere. But still, we are very much underdeveloped, and that was just because of the lobbying, of the very successful lobbying of the industry. And the second example is a very successful strategy or tactic better, which in this way was fortunately not successful, but in general it is, which is scaring companies with legal actions. And the case I want to share with you was a suit that the meat lobby in Spain launched against a vegan company because of a banner that this vegan meat producer was hanging on a street in Madrid. And the banner was publicizing their vegan meat food with a slogan that said something like, "We are not polluting so much as the meat industry," something like this. And they were sued by the meat lobby. And in the end, things ended well because the lobby didn't succeed. But of course, that's something that this type of vegan corporations that are promoting alternatives to animal-based food, not just because of course, the environment, but because of animal ethics. But they in general are not very, very big companies. Yeah. So for them, these sort of legal threats are very, very important. And in this case, I know because I was involved in the issue, because I was consulted, but it didn't appear in the media. It was something really invisible, and I wonder why. Probably because also of the pressure of the meat industry, which is a huge advertiser in media. So I think that we are, Spain, it's a very good example of how climate change obstructionism can go ahead very strongly, just because of this combination of inaction and not commitment from the side of the governments, whatever the political color, and a very strong lobbying industry with all sorts of tactics to lobby and to threat and scare smaller competitors. So I think that's 3 minutes, sorry, if it's too much. Yes, too much, I see, sorry.
Thank you, and thank you also for mentioning the role of media, right, in terms of limiting what people know about the tension. Ruth, let's hear
I will be quick.
Yeah.
So
And so I don't know,
think-
can everybody see the 3-minute timer, or is it just me? Everyone can.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so what I'll be quick. I think the best way to explain what's behind the climate obstruction in the UK is you can think of it as a very small elite group, a group of individuals as well as organizations essentially tied to those tied to free market capitalism. Let's state some of that goes back to the Thatcher era. And when we look at specific actors within the or who are vocal advocates in the UK that want to obstruct action on climate change, we can think of those that have worked under the tenure of Margaret Thatcher during that time of destroying trade unions, expanding this neoliberal project out. And several of those working under Thatcher have then gone on to be key vocal advocates in the obstruction movement in the UK. For example, Nigel Lawson, who originally set up the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which then changed its name to Net Zero Watch. And this is a perfect example of showing that those economic ideas with the climate issue and the change over time, specifically when the Global Warming Policy Foundation was founded and started to emerge, it was very anti-science. And so very similar to FACT in the US, to some of the stuff that came from the Heartland Institute in the US, that climate denialism in its traditional form was the rhetoric that came out. It also played out in the voices of current politicians and or politicians who had previously worked for newspapers, such as Boris Johnson and his columns in the Telegraph on climate change and the climate change issue. I can give a reference for some of those, which were denying climate change, the science. However, over time, recognizing that that isn't working, that has shifted to some of those economic arguments. And central to the obstruction arguments in the UK now is very much around British sovereignty, and energy security, particularly after the back of Brexit and some of those ideas and notions around becoming an independent supplier. We have our own oil, we have our own gas, and some of those narratives are starting to be and are used to justify potential increases in oil and gas production despite the commitments laid out by government. And I'll leave that one there.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you so much. Christian, let's hear a bit more about Australia.
Thank you. Yeah, look, I think in Australia, business actors have really kind of played both the inside and the outside lobbying game. You know, they've worked through firms, industry associations to build networks with the federal bureaucracy, which has arguably shaped climate change for more than a few decades here. But in other cases, they've also played the outside game. They've mobilized large financial resources, at least on an Australian scale, to fund advertising campaigns on television and elsewhere to kill off policies such as a super profits tax on the resources sector, which we saw some years ago. But I think maybe the best expose on the structure and tactics of obstruction groups in Australia came more than a decade ago. Back in 2006, John Howard was our Prime Minister, no friend of climate change, refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol back in the day. But a former staffer, a ministerial staffer in his government, I guess, had a change of heart and did some research and released a book based on a series of interviews with a very small group of lobbyists who, for those of you outside Australia, might not have heard this phrase, but they happily self-described themselves as the greenhouse mafia. And really what we learned about from this work was there was really a cabal of powerful fossil fuel lobbyists. They consisted of executive directors of industry associations in coal, oil, cement, aluminium, mining. I think electric utilities were in there too. And many of these people that were the executive directors of these industry associations had previously been in the senior ranks of the Australian public service or the Australian bureaucracy. And so you got this revolving door, obviously, but what you also got was they had a great knowledge of cabinet processes, of committee processes. They had strong kind of personal relationships, and it gave them an unparalleled kind of inside access to shaping climate policy. And perhaps one of their biggest wins way back in 1996, they derailed attempts under a former Keating government to actually implement a carbon tax. So that's back in 1996, and we're obviously still having these debates now in Australia. The other interesting thing about their influence was that such was their influence, according to this work anyway, that many other industries that were kind of outside that fossil fuel supply chain, you know, refrained from participating in public debates. So big groups like the Business Council of Australia didn't actually get into the public debate to kind of support ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, for example. They decided to stay on the sidelines because they were worried about backlash from government and other industries. So similar to what some of the other speakers have said. I think fortunately now, you know, momentum in Australia for climate action has increased a lot. The election results a few weeks ago show that. And so what we see is the climate denial arguments move, you know, that have dominated obstruction efforts in the 90s and 2000s have really moved to a kind of more insidious line of argument that accepts the science, but interprets the findings in ways that are kind of less threatening to commercial interests, emphasize uncertainties, talk about, you know, renewable technology solutions, which are not yet on the horizon. So we're seeing a shift, but certainly that inside lobbying game is still a key part of obstruction efforts in Australia.
Thank you, Christian. And as you said before, the cross-industry lobbying is a big influence as well. Okay, so Martin.
So my take on this part of the conference is that I'm going to speak a bit about the ideological move in Europe towards the far right and how that has also connected with the spread of disinformation and literal denial. And we have seen this for the last 10 years in Europe. And the expert to go to the publications is Bernard Forstner. And he's been studying this in Denmark and UK and Germany and so forth. And also PhD student Kjell Wolfs are looking into this. And the far right in Europe, Northern Europe and the Nordic countries, they are setting up their own digital media networks, and thereby they are catching a quite large audience currently, around 10 to 15%. And this is changing a bit of the discussions regarding climate science in the Nordic and in the Northern Europe. Another type of research that I want to direct you to is the work by Dieter Pleve and others. They're doing work on the Atlas Network, those type of think tanks. Nuria is also part of that. And there we find actors who are supporting each other with policy work and writing reports and inviting them to conferences. And in some similar way as some of the think tanks in the US, Atlas Networks can be described as supporting that type of action in Europe. I also want to bring up, if I'm an expert in something in this field, I've done a lot of work on gender, and not least connecting to what we call industrial breadwinner masculinities. And this comes out of the work of Riley Dunlap and Armac Wright, who wrote the article on Cold Dudes back in the days. And we really see how certain forms of masculinities are connected to fossil fuels, to meat, to car use, and to specific industries and mining and extractive industries. And this can also explain how this type of backlash against climate policies that we also see. To end, I also want to say something that now when we in Europe are doing research historically on these type of issues, we see, as Franta, for example, doing work on Total and in Sweden, that climate obstruction has a longer history here than maybe we thought. And maybe we need to think of this as a global phenomena from the start and think about the research in those terms and ways to get really to know on the bottom of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for bringing up the gender dynamics as well, and with the rise of the conservative right and linking those together. And in some ways, you could say perhaps the Nordic countries were ahead in terms of the delay, maybe not the denial, right? They were the first movers maybe in the delay strategy early on. Okay, Carlos, back to you.
Great. Well, I had mentioned previously the actors that have their economic interest in this climate obstruction. And perhaps now I'll just mention some actors who are committed to a political ideology that tries to associate climate denial, climate delay, and obstruction together with other ultra-conservative agendas, framing climate change as climatism or as globalism, for example. I could recall some think tanks like Instituto Milênio, Fórum da Liberdade, just to give you some examples, but also media and social media like Gazeta do Povo, O Antagonista, some social forces that are organized within the National Congress in Brazil, and something that is extremely interesting, across different political parties. They are not, concentrated in one or two political parties, but across at least 8 or 9 different political parties, which gives them lots of support in elections. Cultural and religious frames would include, for example, something like pro-climate policies destroy jobs. Then why should we adopt pro-climate policies in a developing country where employment is so urgent and needed? Pro-climate policies impinge on economic development policies and strategies. And another kind of frame that we can find very easily in their narratives is the following. Scientists are not 100% sure about the effects. It exists, but the effects are not so sure. Then I think that in Brazil, aside from the fossil lobby, which exists, but mainly from the lobby of agribusiness, as I had mentioned, and to a certain extent, mineral extraction, which is very much interested in deploying its activities also in indigenous lands, which are environmentally and socially protected areas, according to the law, they get associated with ultra-conservative Christians, including ultra-Orthodox Catholics, not only Neo-Pentecostals, who play a pivotal role in delay and obstruction. I think that climate change is yet another idea, just like gender, human rights, indigenous peoples, that these sets of actors must engage with, particularly because national surveys have shown that the youth is very much pro-climate and pro-environment. And perhaps one of the main goals is to avoid the debate on the development model for a developing country and the development politics that is that underlines this development model. A final word on the transnational forces, because I think that as my previous colleagues has just mentioned, we are dealing with a global problem. There are singularities in national context, but we are definitely dealing with a global problem. And there are some transnational forces that play a vital role in Brazil in terms of funding, networking, in terms of human resources. I could just recall the Koch brothers, Mises Institute, and people like Bannon and social and media like the Breitbart News, for example. I will stop there, and then later on I can come to other issues if you're interested.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you. And now back to Omar. And Omar, I really appreciated your point of Bangladesh being among the most vulnerable and yet, delay an obstruction as well. So
Yeah,
love to hear
sorry.
more.
Okay, so I'll highlight two. I'll begin with discursive frames and rhetorical strategies deployed by the main actors in this game. So I will highlight two separate discursive frames used by the main actors in Bangladesh's power and energy sector, one used by the policymakers and the other by the development partners. For the Bangladeshi policymakers, the main discursive frame is the supply of low-cost energy to meet Bangladesh's energy security. They consider coal as the cheapest energy, primary energy. Recent official calculations, however, show that solar power is cheaper than coal power, even in the Bangladeshi context. They also mobilize another discursive frame to justify their unwillingness to move towards renewable energy. One part of this frame is the lack of available land in a land-scarce, densely populated country. The other part of this argument is that solar power is not a reliable source of energy because its availability is not guaranteed continuously for 24 hours a day. Therefore, solar power or renewable energy, except hydro, will remain negligible or marginal in Bangladesh's energy mix. I am quoting here from the most senior policymaker that it will remain as an icing on the cake. For Bangladesh's development partners, particularly China and Japan, the main discursive frame is the role of clean coal and the state-of-the-art technology in climate mitigation and low carbon development. Both actors consider their coal-fired power plants as their contribution to helping Bangladesh address dual goals, ensuring energy security and reducing carbon emission. Japan considers its financing of several coal-fired power plants in Bangladesh as its contribution to climate finance to climate vulnerable countries. It is interesting to note that the Bangladeshi government seeks such climate financing to build coal-fired power plants with ultra supercritical technology as part of its possible mitigation actions to deliver the conditional contribution as it laid out in its recent nationally determined contribution submitted during COP26. I guess I'm out of time. I'll talk more about the structure and tactics if I find time later.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you for connecting with, as a couple people in the chat have said, some of the same strategies with clean coal and other. Thank you for that. Next, let's see, back to Justin and then Deborah. Yeah.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, I'll just say that I think, at least with research in the US, we often too narrowly focus on specific tactics, I would say, and sometimes we forget to incorporate in our analyses broader cultural trends. And this is kind of building off Martin and Carlos as well. But most notably in the US and in other parts of the globe, obviously, the emergence of what some call like a post-truth culture, and how this can work hand in hand with efforts to obstruct climate action by sowing distrust. And it's, the intentional subordination of reality that leads to widespread science denial that we're seeing, from domains such as climate change, obviously, but then election results, vaccinations, and political and business leaders, as well as, influential public figures, weaponize the inherent uncertainty in truth seeking and mislead people in this way. And of course, if we cannot even weakly agree on a shared understanding of reality, then I think we're in much deeper trouble. But I would say too that climate obstruction research is really well positioned, and in a lot of ways does this kind of work because we focus on anonymity, we focus on secrecy and these dynamics that can really supercharge a post-truth culture, post-truth thinking. So that's just my general pitch, I think, for better integrating some of the broader cultural problems we see and the cultural epistemology in different locations into the type of climate obstruction research we're doing.
Thank you, Justin. And I was just, as you were speaking, I was also thinking about delay tactics getting kind of more sophisticated, more and more pro-environmental. It gets harder to discern, right? Like what is delay versus what is legit commitment. So I think that's something that we can discuss as well. Thank you. And Deborah, and then I am going to synthesize a few of the questions that have been in the chat. So we will come to some more specific questions. But Deborah, why don't we give you your...
Okay, so structure and tactics first. It's certainly lobbying the fossil fuel industry, both as individual corporations and at the behest or in the form of the industry associations are frequent and very successful lobbyists. And I think importantly here, these relationships aren't just with legislators, they're with the ministries. So with ministries of environment and natural resources, it's basically an open door to representatives of the fossil fuel industry and their industry associations. Newer in the game, I would say, are industry organizations like we have one now called the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which are trying to make the case that, we're, our oil and gas industry are climate leaders and, therefore, look elsewhere. We do have, I would say, so-called grassroots organizations, but not, I would say, your conventional AstroTurf variety, because they are rather fossil fuel supporting organizations and don't even necessarily explicitly talk about climate change at all. These operate primarily through social media. So we have examples like Energy Citizens, Oil Sands Action, Rally for Resources. These are groups that have very strong following on Facebook and Twitter and are very active. We have a handful of media personalities, certainly, that are on side. We have Canada's own version of Tucker Carlson in Rex Murphy, who often, raises the flag of Canada's fossil fuel industry. The industry certainly has a strong influence over school curriculum, over the kind of the culture and activities of small towns across the prairies in particular, and they have influence over our universities, which I don't even have time to delve into here. So moving to kind of more of a focus on the discursive frames that are used here. There's a lot to cover here. So I'm gonna be really quick. So we do still have, I would say, a very entrenched hard denial discourse that is in play here. You hear climate is a hoax, it's part of a globalism agenda, it's conspiracy. And importantly, I think that this discourse has become increasingly linked to far-right nationalist and populist sentiments. And that's worrying to me because those sentiments are on the rise here and elsewhere. And that might mean that this hard denial discourse can also kind of perhaps experience a resurgence in legitimacy in the coming years. Far more mainstream, of course, are the soft denial claims that climate change might actually be good for Canada. But really, I think, and here's another, I think, important aspect of the discourse in Canada, and that is that in some ways, these explicit climate discourses are overshadowed by fossil fuels supporting discourses. And so in effect, if we can convince that our fossil fuel industry is absolutely essential to Canada, then we don't even need to confront climate science at all, because it just becomes kind of a non-issue. The main frame here, of course, is that Canadian fossil fuels are more ethical, more environmentally friendly than other regions. And so even if we accept that a transition needs to happen, we should be the last industry standing. Techno-optimism, for sure. There's a lot of emphasis now on carbon capture and storage and financial backing from our state governments. federal and provincial and supporting carbon capture and storage. And that is closely linked to kind of a strategic ignorance of downstream emissions. So all we have to worry about is the emissions that happen at our sites of production, because that's the biggest source of emissions in Canada. And we relieve ourselves of responsibility for the emissions that happen from our resources at sites of combustion.
Yeah.
Then there's also the dismissal of responsibility based on our small size, particularly hear about well, what is China doing, what is India doing? And then lastly, final one I would say is the criminalization of environmental activism, including notably Indigenous land defenders, is a huge and very consequential discourse here in Canada. So all told, what Ottawa ends up doing is trying to make the case that yes, we are climate leaders, and we need to support our fossil fuel industry to generate the funds to support our climate leadership.
Great summary. Thank you, Deborah. What I'd like to do, we do have just another 10 minutes, and there's been a few questions in the chat that I just kind of want to, I'm going to try to combine together about kind of recent disruptive events and how that has changed or how it contributes to these strategies and also the narratives and the stories that are being told. So there was a specific question to you, Christian, about Australia and fires and the some of the intense disruptive climate events, and how has that impacted the obstructionism and the tactics and the actors. And then there was also a question about bringing up the war in Ukraine as another disruptive phenomenon going on in the world right now that is obviously has an influence on the narratives about fossil fuel reliance, right? Both in, oh, we have to hurry up and get off fossil fuels quicker because of the geopolitical instability, or, it demonstrates how, and also the inflation that is associated with the war in Ukraine and other things all coming together, that how central fossil fuels really are. So let's start with Christian responding about Australia, and then if anyone else wants to jump in on disruptive events and how they're changing, resulting in some shifts in strategies or narratives here, that might be a good way to integrate a few of the questions in the last minutes here. So Christian.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Sarah, for the question. Yeah, so on the east coast of Australia, where the population centres are, like Sydney and Melbourne, we've literally had floods and fires almost consistently now for the last 18 months. So I guess there's two levels to look at what impact they've had. If you look at the peer-reviewed research, there's been a little bit done. I can post it in the chat in a moment, mapping opinion polling data with extreme weather events by some colleagues at ANU and elsewhere. That actually shows that extreme weather events don't seem to have a large effect on climate change beliefs. And I think there's been similar studies, perhaps by the same authors. I think it's in the journal Climatic Change for the US. So we're not seeing, at least in the peer-reviewed data, that play out. That said, much less convincingly, anecdotally, I think there's good reason to think that the election results here the last few weeks, where we've gone from 9 years of conservative government to a much more progressive government, that climate change did play a role. The reason I say that is because we had a number of independent candidates not tied to a party that ran hard on climate change and actually knocked off incumbents in what Americans might refer to as red states, or deep red seats that were unthinkably conservative, that have now switched and elected candidates who've run hard on climate change. So there's some kind of, I think there's some reason to think that what's been going on in Australia the last 18 months has affected particular constituencies, but that still doesn't play out in the peer-reviewed data as yet.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to respond to that question just about other disruptive events or other contexts? I guess just raise your hand or. Martin, and then Carlos.
I can say just short on Russia's war against Ukraine. I'm doing some policy work on the behalf of the International Energy Agency to support EU leadership on policies. It is obvious that this war has displayed the deep dependence on fossil fuels for countries in Europe, which on the surface say that they are in a big transition towards renewables and all those kind of things. But it really shows the really deep dependencies, which can be seen as a possibility in that sense. We see very few large and big policies as yet. Some minor countries are cutting their fossil gas dependency, but there's not these kind of big shifts in investments or those kind of things yet. Maybe come during the summer or in the beginning of the autumn. But what we see, which is really worrying, is the price rise, and that we don't curb the demand, because it looks a bit like the 1970s, end of 1970s, and we know that the fossil fuel industries and those countries really got hold of a big chunk of money during that time, which they spent on different types of obstruction through think tanks. So that's quite worrying in that way. So those three are my thinking on the Russian war against Ukraine. In addition to a totally destructive and really terrible war, of course.
Thank you, Martin. Carlos.
Yes, I would like just to mention some extreme events that have been happening in Brazil. Floods, sandstorms, which is something very new to Brazil, by the way. And it's interesting because we have elections this year, right? And Lula da Silva from the Workers' Party has popped up as the main contender against Bolsonaro. He's very strong in the national polls these days. And it's interesting to see how the narratives have differed. Bolsonaro has framed these floods and extreme events, these disruptive events, as something normal that happens all the time. It's part of nature. And then Lula da Silva has just brought up a kind of a climate justice narrative, saying that those who suffer from these events in Brazil are those who are poorer, are those who have a kind of housing which is not adequate. They live near to mountains, housing is not good enough, etc., etc. And it's interesting because there are framings that are popping up for the elections which are totally different. And I think that one challenge that is going to be on the table for the progressive center-left coalition, if ever it wins the elections in Brazil this year, is to see how serious and rigorous policies will be engaged to put climate and development together. Because of course, I mean, we have the right to development in Brazil and we want it, but what kind of development do we want? And how do we associate pro-climate policies with development model in Brazil? I think that is the main challenge. It seems that Lula da Silva is trying to bring this on board. Let's wait and see how elections develop and how the electoral campaign brings climate and environmental issues into the debate.
Yeah. Thank you, Carlos. So we're almost at time. I did want to acknowledge there's another really good question in that about how, given all the intertangled lobbying and government, how can climate justice activists and advocates, where are the leverage points for disrupting some of this? And I guess I also want to acknowledge, we're moving into such even more divisive and, I think it was you, Christian, who mentioned the climate wars, and the fossil fuel and other interests kind of digging in their heels even stronger, right? As it gets even more threatening. So I don't know if anyone has any last very quick thoughts on kind of, you know, where there are some leverage points or points of optimism, maybe. If anyone wants to just very quickly, and because we do want to stay on schedule so we can stick with the program. So if anyone, any of the panelists have any last very quick thoughts to end us on, that would be great. Nuria.
Yes, connected to some comments in the chat that I have just also answered there. There is this reaction towards, because what we are talking about is how to make people to react at all levels, corporate, governmental, personal. And there is this comment in the chat about the people feeling very, very shocked by the suffering of non-human animals in the fires in Australia and other places because of the impact of climate change. And we have been reflecting about this. And my view is that, and I think that's a positive thing, that animal suffering and focusing on more non-species or interspecies ethics, where we fight against climate change, not because just us humans, but because all life must be, all sentient life must be respected. These feelings we may have towards non-human animal suffering because of climate change or whatever, but in this case, because of climate change, can be a helpful trigger for making people to react, because I think it's easier to react facing a koala being burned than just facing habitat loss, which is an abstract concept, just an idea. I think that's a positive thing. We have this like stuff.
Thank you, Nuria. And I think that is very, that's also aligned with increased attention right now to the biodiversity crisis, right? And its links to climate. And so I think that's a very, it's a good point to end on, I guess. We are at the end of the time, right, Timmons? I think so.
Yes, I mean, we could go a couple more minutes because the other session has about an hour and 15. So,
okay.
But if there were last thoughts, I would say 3 more minutes, 5 minutes at the most.
Okay.
And those who are here for the other session, hang in there. We'll be right there.
Deborah.
Since we have the time on that last question, there are a couple of trends happening here that I think are relevant, and that is the places in which division is being sown within what would be supportive sectors. So like to take one example, a lot of oil and gas production activities across the prairies are enormously environmentally consequential in ways that are becoming really glaring, and it's affecting rural communities. It's affecting, you know, their farmlands. It's affecting the health of their families, and so that's causing a lot of questioning amongst, you know, former strong supporters of conservative politics and the fossil fuel industry. And to add insult to injury, there's basically, it's becoming the norm now that these oil and gas players are effectively reneging on their financial responsibilities. And so there are a number of rural municipalities that are owed back taxes by the fossil fuel industry, just, you know, in, you know, 6-7 digits. And, you know, those rural municipalities, of course, that's their lifeline. And so gender is another big place in which division is being sown. I mean, it just so happens to be that, you know, these, you know, places where industries like fossil fuels are predominant are also places in which, you know, women, the differences between men and women with respect to their participation in the economy and the distribution of benefits from that economy are largest. And so I think, you know, being able to observe where these divisions are happening and you know, to seek to, you know, to reach out and engage in conversations with those groups that are, you know, increasingly realizing that they're not receiving the benefits that they were expecting from this industry, I think is important.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. So I think we probably should close it here. And I will just want to thank everybody and for great discussion, and also acknowledge how much potential research there is here in terms of, you know, comparative strategies in different contexts, and so much about the sectoral lobbying, right? Agriculture, real estate, not just energy, all of that. So there's so much here. And as Timmons started us off with, you know, we really know so little because so much of this is hidden and secretive. So there's so much research potential here. So anyone here who's looking for new PhD projects, there's a lot here. So okay, I'll hand it over back, I guess, back to you, Timmons.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Jenny, way to go. That was awesome. And panel, great job. I think that was a blockbuster session. Because I may be wrong, but I don't think we've ever had that kind of an international look around the world at climate obstruction in 8 countries before. I mean, that's how early we are. And I want to congratulate everybody for those great points and hope we can keep the discussion going. I really have enjoyed that. So now we're switching to the next session, which is about climate negotiations and the role of the fossil fuel industry. Again, 30 years of negotiations, and this has been very little discussed. Some people make the comparison of having the tobacco companies in maybe a negotiation on lung cancer or health or something like that. So we're going to hear 4 quite different perspectives on this. And I guess Jake or whoever's behind our assistant's camera, it might be great to pull everybody up at once. Maybe we can have, like we had at the end of the last session with all 4 of our panelists. So, how is their influence felt of the fossil fuel industries? How has their role changed? Who's sought to remove them from the talks and on what basis? Who's acted to resist that? Should we have them here or should we not? Yeah, and there's much more to talk about. So we're going to have 4 panelists: Hossam Mutarai, who is a research fellow at King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, Kaspark, and she'll be speaking for herself. I hope I have that right. Haro van Asselt, who's a professor of climate law and policy at the University of Eastern Finland, and who I know from working a lot with the Stockholm Environment Institute. I can't remember if you're still affiliated or not. I think, yes, he's nodding. So I think I got that right. Hans-Josef Fell, from president of Energy Watch Group, and Harjeet Singh may be coming late. He's over at the negotiation hall. We'll see if he pops up here. Senior advisor of climate impacts at the Climate Action Network International, which of course is the umbrella group of most of the civil society organizations that participate in the UN climate negotiations, and who come together each time there's a big negotiation and manage to really represent civil society around the world. So I have a series of questions that I have sent to the panelists, and I think I'll try to stick to that. I also, for those panelists, we have them in our Google Doc that we're going to be also taking questions from the audience. And it was really exciting to see the participation from the audience in the last section. That was great. So first of all, maybe you could go quickly down the table. I'll go down the table and have you each introduce yourself and describe your organization, your role in your organization, and maybe your organization's position on what role fossil fuel firms and industry organizations should play in the negotiation. And if you'd like to start on this, Haro, I thought we could start with you. To what extent and how have the use and production of fossil fuels been addressed in the climate negotiations? And I don't think we need a timer for this smaller panel, at least not right now. Maybe we'll try it later.
All right, so I take that's a few questions at once, but I'll first say a few more things also where I come from. My organization, or at least my university, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have a position on fossil fuel industry and the climate negotiations, even though I have some personal thoughts about that. We can talk about that in a second as well. But maybe I'll explain briefly where I come from in terms of my research. So in the past few years, I've been looking a lot at what is called supply-side climate policies. So policies that are aimed at the restriction of the production of fossil fuels. And I've been interested in seeing what kind of policies can we look at, and also how can we promote international governance to promote these types of policies, to also ultimately ensure that they're implemented in an effective and fair fashion. And the reason why we're talking about these types of policies, and why at least I've been interested in looking at also international governance in this regard, is that increasingly we see a number of reports from the International Energy Agency, the UNEP Production Gap Report, as well as scientific articles basically indicating that if we're serious about meeting the Paris Agreement climate goals of 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees, we need to leave the majority of fossil fuels in the ground. So that's the basic message that also spurs my own research. Timmons here already mentioned the Stockholm Environment Institute, and this is where a lot of my work has started on this issue. We've organized a number of conferences on supply-side climate policies, a number of special issues, and also this is where the idea of the production gap reports started originally, and I was happy to be involved in at least some of the reports. Now, more specifically, and also more recently, I've been looking at international governance of fossil fuel supply, looking not only at what is out there, like so what does existing international governance say about fossil fuel production, but also looking at what could we conceive of for the future. And I already saw a link just now in the chat to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is one of those ideas. And I also saw Peter Newell already online, and I'm sure he'll be talking about this tomorrow as well. This is clearly one of those ideas where we can think about, well, how can we actually develop international governance on fossil fuel supply? Now, taking a step back and trying to respond to your question about what the climate negotiations have been, or maybe rather have not been saying about fossil fuels so far. And I think it's important to really fully realize this. And I think a lot of you who've been working on the climate negotiation, you're probably aware of this. But if you come new to the climate negotiations, it might sound baffling that even though we know fossil fuels being responsible for 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions, they're not really addressed directly in any of the climate treaties. So the Paris Agreement, Kyoto Protocol don't even mention fossil fuels. The UNFCCC does mention fossil fuels, but in a very particular context, namely the context of response measures. And we're talking here about the impacts of mitigation measures that may be felt in countries that are heavily dependent on fossil fuel production, export, or use. In the last 3 decades, there have definitely been discussions about fossil fuels in the response measures context. There's also been discussions about moving away from fossil fuel finance. And those of you who know the Paris Agreement, you'll know that there's an Article 2.1c, which basically instructs states to, or has as an objective, to make sure that financial flows are in line with low greenhouse gas emissions development. And clearly, there are some nudges that suggest that we need to move away from fossil fuels. At the same time, none of the COP decisions, or hardly any of the COP decisions, as well as the treaties, as I already mentioned, really talk about fossil fuels. And there's a very easy explanation, because some states have been opposed to this from the beginning. They will say, well, the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement, they're not an energy treaty. And we need to not discriminate between the different sources of emissions. And in my view, those arguments are at best disingenuous, given the amount of emissions that can be traced back to fossil fuels. Now, of course, as probably many of you will know or follow the news, COP26 was in that sense a bit of a watershed, where we now finally have a decision that talks about the phase down of coal-fired power. We finally have a decision that talks about the phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So we finally see a recognition of fossil fuels as something that needs to be addressed by states through mitigation measures. And again, this may sound completely obvious if you think, well, fossil fuels need to be addressed to tackle climate change, but it took parties to the UNFCCC and ultimately 3 decades to come to that the type of decision. But of course, that also gives us opportunities, and I'm happy to talk about that later. But I do want to maybe say one final thing about the Glasgow decision. I think it's momentous in some ways that indeed 3 decades late, there is this recognition, okay, we need to do something about fossil fuels. At the same time, it's very interesting to also see what is not said. So nothing is said is really about oil and gas, for example. So they're talking about coal-fired power, not about coal mining, and not about oil and gas production. Also with fossil fuel subsidies, we're only talking about inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And if there are any lawyers out there, you'll also see that the language is very hortatory, very framed in a non-binding way. So it can easily be criticized. But even then, I would suggest it is a watershed, and it at least allows for future discussions about fossil fuels to be had slightly more easily than in the past.
Thank you, Haro. That's very helpful. I think Hans Joseph, it would be good to hear then the position of your organization on this and your reasons for concern about fossil fuels. I hope you could shed some light on this question. Fossil fuel corporations and the trade organizations have had a role in the UN climate negotiations since about 35 years ago. But how has that role changed, and how is their influence felt? And thanks for being with us, to the whole panel.
Yeah, thank you, Timmons, for invitation and for introduction. First of all, my name is Hans-Josef Fell. I'm the president of the Energy Watch Group. The Energy Watch Group is an independent and non-profit think and do tank based in Berlin. The mission of this organization is to accelerate political action towards renewable energies and climate protection. Therefore, we conduct scientific analysis, policy advices, and dialogues. Besides being the president of the Energy Watch Group, I was a member of the German parliament from 1998 until 2030. During that time, I have also co-authored the German Renewable Energy Act in 2000, the basic for renewable growth all over the world. And during my time as a member of the German parliament for over 15 years, I experienced the lobbying influence of the fossil fuel industry at first hand, almost on a daily basis. They were everywhere. At first, the lobbyists wanted to convince us in the parliament that renewable energies would be too expensive. I speak over 20 years ago. Renewables would be too expensive, not reliable, did not create a base load, and were therefore unsuitable for climate protection. These are not new messages. This is very old, these messages. But we, the member of the parliament in 2000, we already convinced at that time that 100% renewables energies are the most important contribution to climate protection, because they would cut 60 or 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions and end the use of oil, of coal and natural gas. So the fossil lobbyists learned from us and encountered resistance. Therefore, they focused their lobbying activities more to the German government and to the European Commission, and especially on public relations, where they spread false arguments against renewable energies in large campaigns. Most important is the lobbyists argued that we need competition in the energy market. Competition in an energy market where fossil and nuclear is highly subsidized, renewables are expensive, they could not compete in this time. And therefore, this request to competition was the main point against renewable energies. And the instruments what they introduced were emission trading and auctioning instead of a feed-in tariff in renewable energy sector. Both are the main instruments who canceled the growth of renewable energies. And they were very successful on European level, later in 2012 on German government level with Chancellor Merkel. And the proposal was, when Germany proposed new instruments, Germany is told to be the leader in renewable energies and climate protection, the world will follow. And it happened. They organized also not fit-in tariffs. What they began very successful in China and in Spain and in plenty other countries, but they changed to auctioning system and to emission trading, much more. So the overall, I got to know very intensively how the lobbying of the fossil fuel industry works and how it obstructs climate protection. And this experience feeds into the daily work of the Energy Watch Group, an organization I founded in 2006. We are very, very small, only 3 staffs, but I hope we can make some influence to the world to open the eyes how the fossil industry influences, and we should not forget, the fossil industry is mostly combined with the nuclear industry, and therefore we should speak every time over the lobbying of fossil and nuclear industry.
Thank you very much. Great introduction, and nice to have your perspective of experience in the German parliament and more of a historical perspective, very useful. Jose, I'd like to turn to you. From the perspective of the oil exporting countries, what are the risks that are posed by the global energy transition? What does it mean for an organization like OPEC, the Organization for Oil Producing and Exporting Countries, and climate negotiations? And thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Timmons. And first, I would like to thank you, Stephen, CSSN, and DII for organizing this conference. And very happy to be here today. First, I will introduce my institution, which is CAPSARC, based in Riyadh. I'm a research fellow there. And CAPSARC doesn't have any institutional position on the issues. And I will be, as you said, my statement reflects my own views. So one of the important topics that CAPSARC is working on is the advancement of the circular carbon economy, which the CCE framework, which was endorsed by the G20 in 2020. And this framework builds on the well-accepted principles of circular economy and applies them to managing carbon emissions, to reduce CO2 emissions, and to reuse carbon as input for feedstock and fuels, and to recycle carbon into new products. And circular carbon economy embraces all the 3 R's and adds to them a 4th R, which is to remove the excess carbon from the atmosphere. This framework encourages countries to take advantages of all technologies and forms of energy according to resource availability and national circumstances. And to be clear about this framework, it is renewables and nuclear and other non-hydrocarbon technologies are important aspect of this framework. So regarding your questions, what is the perspective of oil exporting countries? One of the important concerns for oil countries has been to keep climate talks focused on emissions and not to be derailed by ideological views against hydrocarbon. And from practical perspective, what matters is to limit the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere, and all technologies and fuel options, including hydrocarbons, should be considered. And oil exporting countries have different national circumstances, and their economies will have, and even energy systems will have different transition paths. But all of them will need continued steady flows of export revenues to be able to finance their transition. Some of these countries already signaled that the speed of their transition will be contingent on the oil revenues that they will get. For OPEC as an organization, OPEC can contribute to a transition beneficial to all parties, either by enabling smooth global energy transition and safeguarding oil market stability and preserving future oil revenues to finance the economic diversification and the domestic energy transition of oil exporting countries. And these countries are not only important energy actors, but they are also impacted. And some of these countries heavily impacted by global climate change. And some of the risk that they're facing is related to water scarcity, drought, desertification, and so on. And one of the perspectives for these countries is to use revenues from hydrocarbon export to finance the adaptation to climate conditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hassa. That's very helpful. I'm going to come back to you, Haro. Could you come back to a question that I can pose more broadly? How can negotiations advance in the context of likely continued industry presence? Does it matter? How do you want to think about that? Or maybe you've said something about it.
I will, okay, so I will make two different points in response to that. One is about continued industry presence, and the other one is about how can negotiations proceed more generally. One thing with continued industry presence, and I've been at negotiations often enough, and I think, and those who have been there as well, you'll often see the kick the polluters out, people standing around, basically trying to make sure that fossil fuel lobbies will be left out of the negotiations. And there is precedent for this. And I think, Timmons, you already referred to this. So you have the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, where tobacco companies are simply not allowed as part of the negotiations. And in a way, one could say simply, well, why don't we transpose that model from the Tobacco Convention and move it to the climate change negotiations, and basically allow or disallow companies, like do not give accreditations to fossil fuel companies, whether it's through the companies themselves or through their accredited organizations. Now, on the one hand, I can see the rationale for that, and I can see the potential benefits, also trying to address some of the concerns that Hans-Josef raised earlier. On the other hand, I think there's a number of challenges that we would have to face or be honest about, at least. First is that a lot of the positions that states, and again, states are making the decisions ultimately in the negotiations. And a lot of those positions are not formed or finally formed at the negotiations. They are formed in the capitals.
Right.
So if we're talking about lobbying, I think then let's talk about what's happening in Brussels, in DC, and other capitals around the world first, because that's ultimately where the main decisions are made. Then the second challenge, I would say, well, okay, you could try and bar access from Shell, BP, ExxonMobil, other oil and gas companies. But of course, we're also dealing with a world where a lot of the oil and gas producers are state-owned enterprise, which are ultimately linked to some of the states who are participating in the negotiations. So very practically already, you will run into some issues there as well. Then the final, and this is something that I haven't seen people raise as a concern much, but again, it would be my concern. Suppose you would be successful and indeed bar access of fossil fuel companies to the negotiations. What's to stop other countries, particularly countries where they're from the global south, who are suspicious of NGOs from the global north? So I'm saying, well, actually, they are interest-based. We don't want them. They have the wrong interest. And again, this is a party-driven process. So a lot of these things are ultimately driven by what states want. And if the states want to bar access from negotiations, they can do so. If you have important states that don't want negotiations to be public or to open to the public, they can do so. So I think there might be certain types of backlash that we maybe haven't fully thought through if you are indeed successful in barring access to fossil fuel companies. Then maybe more generally, how can we continue to address fossil fuels in the context of these negotiations? And here, I guess I'm slightly more optimistic after Glasgow and after the Glasgow Climate Pact. But I guess the message is mainly for NGOs, but also for states that are interested in pushing this agenda forward. Now, the Glasgow Climate Pact, it's a cover decision which was ultimately driven by the UK presidency in last year. As such, it doesn't have, let's say, a running agenda item where you could say, well, next year or this year in Sharm el-Sheikh, we can raise the same issues again easily. Having said that, the UNFCCC is such a fragmented and dispersed process. There are a lot of places where we can talk about this. And I'll just list the most important ones in my view. The first one is that by the end of this year, they need to come up with, or states need to come up with a mitigation work program for before 2030. And I think it's very obvious for me that if you want to follow up with what you said in Glasgow, so phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, phasing out coal-fired power, that is a very reasonable place to start that discussion. And then maybe also see if you can try and broaden that discussion to the things that I just mentioned were omitted, so oil and gas production as well as coal mining. The second place to continue these discussions are in the form of response measures, which I already mentioned. And here you can actually have a broader discussion to also link some of these discussions, not just about phase out, but also about the possibilities for economic diversification, which is super important, as Hossa was already hinting at. Questions more generally about how to ensure that this happens in a just way, so that it happens according to principles of a just transition. So again, response measures, it's not been the most productive venue in the climate change negotiations, but it's certainly a venue where some of these things should be discussed at least. And then the third, and then I'll stop there. The third venue, at least the third area in the negotiations where I think this issue should be taken up, is the global stocktake, which is actually happening right now in the negotiations in Bonn. Where again, there's a lot of discussion about, well, how far are we towards achieving the overall goals of the Paris Agreement? What else could be done? What else needs to be done? And clearly, again, I think from my perspective, this is where questions about phasing out fossil fuels in a just and effective way need to be part of the broader discussion. So, and I think there's other areas as well, but I'll not list them now. But I do think there are ways, and where, let's say, again, states interested in pushing this agenda, as well as NGOs that want to make a change here. There are agenda items, there are opportunities within the UNFCCC process, within the climate negotiations to push this generally forward.
Thank you, Haro. Just I want to have you clarify these kind of jargon phrases of response measures and economic diversification. It sounds, they both sound good, but what do they end up actually meaning in the negotiation?
Sure. Well, response measures, it's a term that you can find in the framework convention, and then sorry, there's okay, thanks. So, and there's now a forum with a very long name, but I will just call it the Forum for Response Measures. But the response measures are the measures taken by, let's say, all of the countries in the world, but primarily OECD countries, so the developed countries, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If these countries successfully reduce greenhouse gas emissions, what will happen? Well, they will reduce also their fossil fuel use. Of course, that has major impacts on fossil fuel producing and exporting countries. So the term response measures is basically what to do, how to address these concerns by fossil fuel dependent countries that may indeed, as also was already indicating, lose some of their income, if that is indeed the way things are going. And as I said, it's been discussed since the beginning, and it's not necessarily the most productive. There's not a lot of decisions in this forum that have come out of it. And also there's a lot of politicking in these discussions where you ultimately do not get necessarily that much progress. But given the topic, I do think it makes sense to have these discussions there. Economic diversification, it's one of the topics that is also addressed in this forum. And here it's about, again, some of the challenges that Hossa was talking about. Well, if a country is heavily dependent on fossil fuels for their economy, for a large extent of their GDP, what are the possibilities for them to diversify and to make their economy dependent on other products or other sectors of the economy? And of course, these are very real questions because in a way you want to avoid any country falling off a cliff edge as soon as the world stops using fossil fuels. So there are questions about transitions and about how to ensure that process is done again in a fair and an effective way.
Thank you. I ask you because I've, in working with you in the past, you've got encyclopedic knowledge of the UN process, and I appreciate it very much. Hosa, I wanted to turn to you. There were a couple of questions raised in the chat about the circular economy and carbon capture and storage, and that carbon capture, as somebody said here at the negotiations, it's always out in the future. That is, it remains extremely expensive. There are a few demonstration projects, but they are not economic and they take a lot of energy to do. And it's remained that way for decades, at least 3 decades that I've been looking at this science since the 80s, some work here in the energy department and of the US. So I wonder, can you tell us more about how far along are the OPEC nations in terms of a transition away from oil and gas and towards diversification, and what are some of the steps they're actually taking? And then if they are relying on capture of carbon, what about this sort of just the technical problem of it being so difficult and energy intensive to do it?
Okay, so certainly there's a talk about the scalability and how commercial CCE technologies like CCUS or DAC. But the same thing was said about renewables 10 or 15 years ago. And we saw that how political will and strong implication for all actors have rendered renewables commercial. So the main point is we need to keep investing in R&D to upscale these technologies. And if you look at the net zero scenarios 2050 that was published by the IEA, oil and gas remain within the energy mix. And these scenarios actually depends on the development in CCUS and other new technologies that are not in the market yet. And hydrogen also one of them, green hydrogen. So these scenarios, if you look at them, and they're really constrained. Some of the assumption that if not been materialized, then the energy security will be compromised. So the main point is that we need to keep investing in these technologies. So what is happening in some countries, oil exporting countries, we have over the recent years, we have been seeing a lot of changes in countries. For instance, Saudi Arabia is taking a lot of action to reform its economy, especially reforming energy prices. So energy prices were subsidized, and right now they're increasing the prices for its domestic energy consumption. In addition, Saudi Arabia is targeting to have 50% of its power sector coming from renewables by 2030, and phasing out oil from the power sectors. Also putting fund to invest in some of the technologies in the CCEs, like CCUS, and wanting to establish an industrial hub for the CCUS. One of the recent 2 initiatives by Saudi Arabia was Saudi Green Initiative, and the Middle East Green Initiative to collaborate with other countries on planting more than or around 50 billion trees. In addition, Saudi Arabia is in its NDC double its reduction target for CO2 emission to 278 million tons per year by 2030, and launching more than 60 programs with an investment around 187 billions. So we see changes, and the countries are actually impacted by climate change. It's not an isolation from the world.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's indeed a monumental effort to change an economy that much, and when with so much reliance on fossil fuels, on one industry in general. Hans Joseph, it would be good to bring you back in here. I think it would be good to hear your thoughts on the negotiations and sort of what do you think, you know, of a ban on fossil fuel advertising, modeled in part on the Tobacco Convention, or do you think that this is from Reclaim Fossilvrij, I don't know how to pronounce that, from one of our audience questions. Could you comment on that and on the negotiations? I mean, you mostly spoke about the German and the EU context the first time around. How do you see fossil fuels and the role that they should have in the negotiations?
I would be happy if we could have a ban of fossil and nuclear fuels, but I believe we cannot realize it in the world. Therefore,
wait. You mean a ban of them in general, but I mean the advertisement was the question. But
advertisement, yes, would also be good. Like we could organize it in smoking areas. It could help a little bit. But my experience is to influence the world is to make the positive impacts and not the negative impacts. Not the bans, but the motivations to go to climate protection, to renewable energies and others. And to organize this means to organize big campaigns on the positive side for climate protections all over the world, not only in Germany and Europe. And we can learn from the fossil industry how to organize campaigns. They did it perfectly over 50 years in a huge amount with a lot of money. They influenced the heads of the people, the politicians, the medias. Medias are very important. They even bought the medias to influence the medias. And so they captured the discussion in the world. We must learn from it. First, they set frames. Not the frames for climate protection, but frames that seems to be climate protection, but has a hidden agenda with fossil and nuclear fuels. These frames are decarbonizing. Decarbonizing means clean coal, CCS, CCUS, efficiency in fossil production, energy sector, natural gas, hydrogen, nuclear, all is decarbonizing. Renewable energies plays a very small role in decarbonizing. Yes, we have a target of 20% renewables and not more. We must learn from the frames. The newest frame is climate neutrality. Climate neutrality means you are allowed to make emissions, but plant some trees and balance the emissions. That's completely wrong. We must cut the emissions completely and stop it. And we must organize carbon sinks with trees and other methods, parallel to cutting the emissions. Only this can help the world. We have too much carbon in the atmosphere. Therefore, we have to reduce not the emissions. We have to reduce the content the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And this is possible only with stopping and with carbon sinks, both together. So what does it mean? We need to learn about it and to make a positive campaign all over the world with the argument, we bring you the cheapest energy. Renewables are the cheapest option of energies. They are it since 5 years. They are it even in reliable energy with storage and with balancing with clean and sustainable bioenergy with hydropower when it is sustainable, not big dams, but smaller one. And when we go this way with geothermal, the combination of renewables, the biggest amount is solar and wind, and with storage systems, this brings you reliable. And you can have it all the time, all over the year. And we should highlight, there is no reliability with fossil fuels. Look, the world fights about fossil fuels. Everywhere where fossil fuels comes from, nearly everywhere, is war. Now in Ukraine, it depends on the fight of the fuels. And they finance the wars with income of the fossil fuels. Russia, Saudi Arabia, and plenty others. So therefore, the positive impacts, you can do it by yourself. Make your energy by yourself. It is possible. My house is completely independent. I have my renewable energy all over the time, even in deep winter time, in the cold winter time in Germany. For my cars, for my heating, for my electricity, no question. It is cheaper. I do not pay any bill for electricity or for fuels for my cars. I don't pay it. So these are positive impacts. When we want to influence the people, we must organize very, very good campaigns, come together with the medias, influence the politicians that they try to bring all these arguments. Then we have a chance that the world will win this game against climate warming.
Thanks, Hans Joseph. Some comments have come in, but I think, Haro, I want to turn to you, and then Harjeet has joined, and we'll bring him in right after that. So Jessica Green asked, isn't fossil fuels built into the Paris Agreement through Article 6, which is, of course, carbon trading mechanisms or any kind of market-based mechanism? Maybe you can clarify that for us. And while you're on it, you said you might be able to say something about fossil fuel advertising.
Yeah, but let me try to take Jessica's excellent question first. It's a tough one to answer properly, also because I haven't been following the details of Article 6. And these days, you need to be a carbon market expert to really follow everything. But of course, the bottom line is that Article 6 makes carbon offsets or carbon offsetting possible also under the Paris Agreement, which ultimately means that fossil fuel companies, but also other countries where fossil fuels are being produced, may want to rely on Article 6 to continue to burn fossil fuels, but then offset that through a range of different projects, whereas ultimately emissions worldwide do not necessarily go down. So in that sense, I think the answer is yes. I wouldn't just single out Article 6, right? Like we also have lots of voluntary carbon markets where through which companies can offset their carbon emissions. But in a way, Article 6 seems to endorse that as well. Then maybe briefly to add on the question or the point from Reclame Fossilvrij, so the fossil fuel free advertising question. An international ban, is that possible or desirable? I think for me, thinking about an international governmental ban, that's quite still far-fetched in my view at the moment. Having said that, I think a lot is possible bottom up. And as I'm sure the person asking the question knows very well, Amsterdam being the first city that banned fossil fuel advertising already gives a hint of where you need to go. Because some of these decisions do not necessarily need to depend on a national government. They can be taken at the local level or at the subnational level. So what in my view is important is trying to connect actors across different countries, working through city networks, working through other subnational networks, and try and bring them together and see, well, actually that advertising ban in Amsterdam seemed to work quite well. Maybe it could work in other cities as well. Maybe, like, how did you design it? How did you approach it? And I think that requires, on the one hand, city officials or subnational officials talking to each other, but of course it also requires NGOs and social movements across borders talking and working with each other, which I'm sure is already happening. But I think there's a lot of prospects and a lot of promise in indeed these transnational campaigns to ban fossil fuel advertising as basically constituting a new transnational norm against that. So I will say basically continue your work and hopefully you'll get there.
Thank you, Haro. I'm going to call on Harjeet if you're ready. Thank you for coming.
And my apologies. A lot has been going on here in the bond session.
Can I just start you off with the big question of introduce yourself and the Climate Action Network, and then talk about sort of what your experience is. What do you think the impact is of the fossil fuel industry on the negotiations, and building on what Haro was just talking about, how can civil society and actors around the world connect to make a difference here?
Sure.
And
thank you so much. And apologies again for joining late. We have been doing a lot of actions on loss and damage finance here in the bond session. So got a lot more involved there. So I'm Harjeet Singh, and I work with Climate Action Network as Senior Advisor, and I'm also associated with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative as the Global Engagement Director. As you can see, my work has been a lot more on climate impacts, but at the same time, it's important to recognize that who has caused the problem in the first place. And this is where we have to put a spotlight on the fossil fuel industry and the role it has played over the last several decades to not allow the progress to happen, not only in the UNFCCC space, but also through their disinformation campaign and their lobbying. They did not allow adequate policies to be formulated to regulate the fossil fuel industry. Yes, there have been has been progress on renewable energy investment, but the reality is that the share of fossil fuels in global energy demand has barely changed in the past decade. I'm sure you know that in 2009 it was 80.3%, and in 2019 it's 80.2%. So we are where we are. So the increased renewable energy that we see actually is feeding into the increased demand, and the share of fossil fuel industry in the energy portfolio remains the same, and that's absolutely worrying. And when we talk about the UNFCCC space, Paris Agreement does not even mention coal, oil, and gas. So when fossil fuels are responsible for 86% of carbon dioxide emissions in the last 10 years, you don't even find a mention of coal, oil, and gas in the Paris Agreement. So which means that there is a lot going on in the background, how they have their handprint on, or their invisible handprint on Paris Agreement, that we don't even mention what's causing the problem. And the way Paris Agreement also has been formulated, it only looks at the demand side of the problem. And I heard briefly previous speakers where we talk about reducing emissions, but we are not targeting the supply side. And this is where, when you look at the role of fossil fuel industry in the energy sector, or the way they have influenced the negotiation, we really need to talk about the supply side, which has not been the conversation so far. And I'm sure you would be aware that at COP26 in Glasgow, the biggest delegation was from the fossil fuel industry. So which means that we somehow explicitly or behind the scenes have provided them seat at the table, and we are expecting the industry to come up with a solution. It's as good as giving tobacco companies seat at the table to fight cancer, right? So this is exactly what we are doing right now with the fossil fuel industry. We must recognize that fossil fuel industry is the problem, and cannot be part of the solution. And advertising ban and such initiatives are welcome, but we need to really get governments to start regulating the industry, which we have not really seen happening. In fact, we see governments are in connivance with fossil fuel industry. They hold a lot of power, and that's how we don't have right kind of policies that have regulated the industry. So in the UNFCCC space, we clearly have to talk about the supply side of the problem, and this is where the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty talks about we need a global framework that is complementary to Paris Agreement. So it's not about junking Paris Agreement, that has a lot of good elements that we need to be banking. But at the same time, we need a new global framework that talks about the supply side. And the challenge is that we have focused so much on the demand side, and we have focused too much on India and China, that we have not looked at countries or petro-states who depend on fossil fuels for their economy, or countries who depend on fossil fuels for their energy needs. And there is no system under UNFCCC that helps them transition from fossil fuels. And here we need to talk about the countries like Nigeria and Azerbaijan and Angola. What kind of support are we providing them? And we have lost decades in the UNFCCC because and we don't see any progress in real terms because we did not look at the supply side. So I think that one missing gap we really need to bridge by having a global framework that looks at not only ending the new exploration immediately, but also phasing out equitably. And at the same time, how do we help workers and communities and countries to adopt just transition with adequate international cooperation and support. So we need to really recognize and acknowledge the missing pieces in the UNFCCC framework so that we can tackle the problem in a much more comprehensive manner. And that's what the world needs at this moment.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I wanted to keep going with you for a moment to talk about sort of, I guess I would say, tensions in the G77. Right? The group of 134 developing countries include the OPEC countries highly dependent on fossil fuels. It includes highly vulnerable countries in AOSIS and the least developed countries. And there has long been a tension over this exact issue on how to deal with fossil fuel dependent countries, how much regulation to put on them. How does that work out from your perspective? And in other words, what would it look like to do what you're describing, having real transition support for countries like Nigeria and Azerbaijan or others, and bigger countries like Iran?
I think the most important thing is to adopt the equity, not just adopt, but the equity principle, which has not been discussed. In fact, the whole discussions about equity have been seen as, oh, this is very toxic, this is very divisive. But the reality is, when you talk about the practicality of implementation of some of these policies, you have to differentiate between countries that are that have low capacity when it comes to GDP. And again, if I name those countries, Algeria's GDP, the income from oil, just from oil, is about 30% of their total revenues. If I talk about Angola, it's about 50%. And in case of Congo and Timor-Leste, it's about 60%. But if you look at their per capita income, it's less than $10,000. And whereas you have countries like UK, Canada, US, where, who have so much of resources and their per capita income is more than $40,000. So look at the disparity. So if you want countries whose economies are dependent on fossil fuel and their per capita income is low, the moment you apply equity principle, who has to move forward much faster and who has the resources. But we never discuss those details. If you want to really operationalize, you have to talk about equity, and it's not rocket science. We know who has historical responsibility, and again, those factors of dependence on economy or energy, and at the same time, their income. And if you apply those principles, if you have that discussion in a much more robust manner, it's very much possible to come up with a frame and a support mechanism that can be provided to these countries. We have, the whole discussion around economic diversification, which is extremely important. It does find mention in the Paris Agreement twice, but are we operationalizing it? Where is the system to support for just transition? What we talked at COP26 was providing $8.5 billion to South Africa. Has anybody seen those $8.5 billion yet? No. Is there any framework that says that money will not go to energy companies, but to workers and communities? No. So which means we need to have those principles of equity at the heart of it. We need to develop a global framework and support mechanism and differentiate between countries who are poor and who also have a historical legacy of dependence on fossil fuels. So I think if we apply those principles in a much more robust manner, it's all possible. But those discussions have never been allowed for the reasons we all know, because fossil fuel industry controls the process in so many ways.
Can you describe cases or examples of how the fossil fuel industry is obstructing in the negotiations from your experience?
Well, they are doing both covertly and also in a very discreet manner. I think I very well remember. I mean, I think the example of how COP26 Glasgow Climate Pact only talks about coal, but not oil and gas. And we know that oil and gas industry is the most powerful when it comes to fossil fuels. And the reality is that on one hand, the overall consumption of coal is going down, but we see rich countries continue to drill and frack oil and gas in their backyard. So we actually allowed, when we talk about climate change, it's all fossil fuels. How come we could not talk about oil and gas as well in the Glasgow Climate Pact? So clearly there is something going on which is influencing countries, and particularly developed countries in this case, or the petrostates who are not allowing this process to recognize the problem that we have with oil and gas as well, as if and then the way gas has been positioned as a transition fuel, which we know is absolutely troublesome. This is not the direction we need to take. And we've also seen that I remember in Warsaw there was a coal summit alongside the Warsaw COP in Poland. So and we have also seen fossil fuel industry even sponsoring UNFCCC, and we had to raise that issue so that this process doesn't take money from the fossil fuel industry. So there have been very explicit, and as I said, at COP26 you saw the biggest delegation from the fossil fuel industry. So they are everywhere. They are working with governments. They are funding the process, or have been for so many years. And of course, the whole disinformation campaign, and even talking about gas as a transition fuel. So yeah, there are multiple problems at various levels, and this is why I said we cannot allow them seat at the table. We need to recognize that they are part of the problem and not the solution.
Thanks. There's many questions coming up, and it's a bit tough to know which to go with, but I wanted to make sure, Hossa, that you got to speak again about these issues that Harjit is raising on transition costs. Have there been good estimates of transition costs? And in the case of Saudi Arabia, there's maybe more funding available to fund a transition, but there's many other poorer countries that have a more difficult situation. Can you reflect on that a little bit for how much it would take? Have there been estimates of how much it would cost to entirely transition the economy? And has Saudi Arabia advanced that idea in the negotiations, and what happened? You're muted, sorry.
Sorry. So I haven't worked on, or I haven't seen an estimate about the cost, but definitely in the energy transition, the countries are having different circumstances and having their own transition paths. But I want just to go back to Rajesh's point about he raised a good point about equity, and but I don't see that banding. Not all. I can see the frustration around the oil industry, but not all companies are the same. You have national companies who represent millions of peoples. Their countries' economy depends on these national companies, and they make decisions based on interest of the countries that they represent. So what I wanted to say that it is crucial to have everyone around the table, and excluding them from the solution. I would imagine that it might need to lead to inferior solution, which some people refer to as the green paradox. So some countries will see that they're losing their market. They will start producing more in the short term, and this might lead to just spiking greenhouse gas emissions. So, which would go against what everyone wants, just to limit this CO2 emission. So it is very important. It's not just about the future energy mix. It's just to engage them, even to help them to navigate through their energy transition.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Haro, you earlier mentioned state-owned enterprises. I mean, how do you deal with them when it comes to the issues that we've been discussing, including exclusion from the negotiations?
Well, it's hard. I was just reading a comment by Jessica Green, also that she wrote an article, but then didn't deal with SOEs. And I think there's a reason for that, because it's difficult. And I think also one of the main challenges for researchers is transparency. Like we're starting to get to know more and more about fossil fuel companies, but for state-owned enterprises, at least for some countries and some enterprises, they're still a black box. Now, we have research organizations such as the Natural Resource Governance Institute in the US, as well as others, who are increasingly focusing on these types of enterprises and their activities and trying to, well, basically help disclose relevant information. But of course, it's going to be very hard. But even with SOEs, I think you need to make a distinction between SOEs that are very tied to a state, and where also the state's, let's say, not necessarily survival, but a lot of the state's economy depends on that one particular SOE, versus a country like South Africa, where you also, of course, have a number of major SOEs, but those sectors might not be as important for the country's economy as these other countries that I mentioned. But I think, and again, I don't have the answer to your $1 million question, but I think transparency and trying to basically disclose information about the production plans of these companies, the financial flows, is a starting point. And of course, given that some of these companies are very closely tied to national governments, I think one of the requests or one of the asks would be for these national governments to start disclosing relevant information about fossil fuel production plants to, again, allow others to, well, either criticize or constructively discuss how to move away from fossil fuels in these countries.
Thanks. I mean, we've seen that, pressure campaigns by civil society organizations are often focused on large private companies with a lot of concern about their reputation in the consumer marketplace. And state-owned enterprises are very difficult, right, for them to address. I'm going to hand the mic over to Bob Brule because we're down to our last about 5 more minutes. Bob, can you unmute?
Yeah, I'm unmuted now. First of all, it's great to see this many people and this discussion going on. My question is in regard to sort of the research literature on the role of state-owned enterprises and international oil corporations, and how they influence the international talks. I don't know any peer-reviewed literature on this at all. Please correct me. But as a group of scholars, where is it? In other words, that would be something I think CSSN would want to desperately fund, because we have nothing. In other words, it's one thing for Greenpeace to come out and say, oh, these people, don't belong, they shouldn't be there. But the press immediately dismisses it. It says it's Greenpeace, so what? They're always going to say that. But if we can have a good peer-reviewed study that shows how state-owned enterprises actively intervene and structure these talks to come up with certain instances, how international corporations fund the big research institutes that then enter into the IPCC and then shift the discourse in certain ways. And I guess my question to the group is, am I missing something? Is there stuff out there? And if so, just throw it in the chat. But is that something we as a group should actively be promoting as part of our research agenda?
And how would one do it well? So
how do we do it
I'm going to
well
turn to
that's gonna
Harjeet
stand?
and then to Hans Josef, and I think we'll wrap up there.
Yes, please. This is very important. My idea to found the Energy Watch Group was an experience in the 20 years ago. More than 90% of all research money for energy research on universities, on research centers and others came from the fossil and nuclear industry. And they influenced the research for their interest. And there is nearly no financing for independent research, and though the world does not know about it, but it is on the table, independent research. Hossa, we have the results of how to go to 100% renewable world, how to go to 100% renewable state or city or anything. Energy Watch Group and others, Jacobson in USA and Stanford University, or plenty others in the world, in Australia, in Sweden, they organized it. All results are the same. When we make a very good scientific report on a technology and economic view, the results are 100% renewable energy system is possible, and it is cheaper than a fossil and nuclear-based energy system, and it came very fast. But all these results are nearly not discussed in the world, because the fossil and nuclear industry defames these results. They tell, oh, this is scientific fake, it is a wrong scientific idea. This is not, or they ignore it. They don't speak about it. So it is our task to bring these results to the world. You could have a cheaper energy world, an energy world without any emissions, without a social economic, together with a social economic impact for all the poorest of the poorest to get energy. Only with renewable energy is this possible, not with fossil and nuclear. So therefore, go to the scientific, to the positive scientific reports, what we can organize it.
Thank you, Hans Josef. I'm going to have Harjeet get the last word since you got here last, and talk about what good research would be about the negotiations and the role of obstruction and so on.
I think the first thing that we have to do is to take away the social license of the fossil fuel industry. Unless we do that, when they visit these negotiations, everybody would see them as a stakeholder. No, they are not a stakeholder, despite all the assurances, and they claim that they're investing in renewable energy. It's less than 2%. They continue to drill more, so they're not part of a solution. That's the first thing. And then, of course, looking at how they influence governments, how they influence messaging, that is extremely important, and how they become part of so-called business NGOs here in the UNFCCC space, and then influence each and every bit of negotiation so that they can continue with business as usual. So I think that's an extremely important aspect. And I would again point, beyond research, we need to really look at the whole focus has to be on supply side through a new framework which is missing, because this demand side discussion can continue. It has to be complemented with the supply side of discussion so that we can put fossil fuel right at the core of the discussion, and then talk about stopping new exploration to phasing out, as well as just transition. And we can't have the discussion on the side. This is the core discussion that we have missed for years and decades, and that's how the role of fossil fuel industry increased over the last few years. I think once we put them under the spotlight, a lot can happen.
Okay, that was a great way to end. I really want to thank all our panelists. I did my best. This was a hard session to moderate because the topics are so many and so diverse, and I really appreciate everybody coming. I wanted to reiterate what Stefan said in the chat. We did want to have a business perspective here, but they a couple had said they would come and then ended up backing out when we said we wanted to ask them to address greenwashing and obstruction as well. So that's unfortunate. We really think they should be part of the discussion here. My thanks to the panelists, for everybody who stayed on. It's been 3 hours of intense discussion. For all the CSSN members, you should have gotten an email today with a link to our networking thing, or you can go to the events site where there should be a link as well. Do I have that right? Jake in the event support? I think that's right. So, and again, let's give a little round of virtual applause to our panel. Thanks much. And I'll see everybody around the negotiating halls and around the virtual meetings tomorrow as we hear from Peter Newell and then have a discussion about loss and damage. So thanks much, everybody.
Thank you.
Way to go. I wish you could hear the applause, but they're deep in the outer space.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.